Good afternoon in Palo Alto, and good day, whatever time it is for those of you who are joining us in other time zones. I'm Roland Green, director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our first event of the spring quarter, the 2023 Marta Sutton Weeks Lecture. Besides those of you who are here in Leventhal Hall, we have many more people in our online audience, including a number of former fellows, friends of the center, whom we're always glad to see again, whether in person or remotely. I like to say at this moment at each event, whoever you may be, current fellow, past fellow, member of the Stanford community, undergraduate, alum, simply an interested person in the world, you're always welcome to join us at these events. More and more over these last several years, we've come to see our mission as that of a humanities center, not only for Stanford, but for the world beyond. It's been a while since our last Marta Sutton Weeks lecture, the spring of 2019 to be exact, and you can guess why that was. In any case, we're glad to be able to resume this series and welcome our speaker and you in person. An endowment created by Marta Sutton Weeks in 1987 provides funds to bring distinguished lecturers such as Sara Ahmed to Stanford for stays varying in duration from a week up to a quarter. The visitors join our community to engage in discussion on a wide variety of humanities topics. In fact, tomorrow morning, Sara Ahmed will be holding a meeting for graduate students here in the boardroom for a workshop. As some of you know, the Stanford Humanities Center is unusual among university-based humanities centers in that we do a number of things at the same time. We house a large number of fellows working on their own projects. This year we have nearly 50 under our roof. We sponsor 15 research workshops over the course of a year, which together hold over 150 meetings to foster collaboration. And we offer events that are open to the Stanford community, such as this one. And the community beyond, it goes without saying. Many of our peer universities divide these functions among 2 or 3 centers, and we're among the few that sponsor all 3 kinds of things. These activities complement and enrich each other. The fellows find their work enlivened by the visiting speakers, while the visitors encounter a receptive audience that includes not only Stanford scholars and students, but many others who have met for the year at this crossroads. In our public events, such as this one, hybrid is our new normal. We're really pleased to be able to connect current and former fellows, of whom we have 42 years worth of former fellows out there. I'm one myself. Faculty, graduate students, and everybody, the community, in both in-person and online conversation. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to note to the remote audience that real-time captioning is available. Please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of your screen, where it says CC to start or stop viewing or the captioning. The up arrow next to the CC icon permits you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, and adjust captions as needed. There'll be an opportunity for Q&A after the talk. And for those of you who are here in person, we hope you will join us for the very nice reception afterwards, our first warm weather reception in a while. And for those members of our virtual audience who would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will do our best to get to it following the lecture. Also, please note that today's lecture is being recorded and will be available to registered audience members in the coming days. At a certain point well into her intellectual career, Sara Ahmed began one of her books with the question, what does it mean to be orientated? She goes on to answer herself. Orientations shape not only how we inhabit space, but how we apprehend the world of shared inhabitants, as well as who or what we direct our energy and attention toward. This exchange with herself might serve as a point of entry into the work of perhaps our leading theorist of how persons and institutions are oriented toward each other, and how we might develop a language and a practice to change the orientations we encounter as given into something more reflective, inclusive, and humane. In a series of influential books, such as The Cultural Politics of Emotion, The Promise of Happiness, Willful Subjects, What's the Use, Living a Feminist Life, and several more, Sara Ahmed has changed how we think about such commonplace ideas as feeling, utility, inclusion, and happiness, almost always as she treats these things in relation to power. Much of her thinking develops in public media, notably her blog, feministkilljoys.com. And most recently, Ahmed has been at work on a research project on common sense while completing 2 handbooks, the Complainer's Handbook and soon to be released, I think already in the UK, but soon to be released in the US, the Feminist Killjoy Handbook, the radical potential of getting in the way. Her talk today will draw on the recent work on complaint and common sense. If I may, just for one moment, speak on a more personal note, my original invitation to Sara was extended in the fall of 2019, soon after I became director of the center. I always thought of her as the ideal visitor for the week's program, where we could draw insight from her, not just for a single event like this, but for a week or more. For obvious reasons, we postponed this event more than once. We reimagined it more than once. It has kept pace with her work as her work has developed. And so finally, it's a great pleasure and actually a relief to be able to have you here, Sara. Join me in giving Sara Ahmed a big Humanities Center welcome.
Thank you so much, Roland, for that introduction. It's a relief to be here. And also thanks to Eric Ortiz for incredible help in getting me here. It's wonderful to be here with you. Thank you to everyone who is here with me in this room and to people who are watching on the Zoom. I'd like to dedicate this lecture to all the students and the early career scholars at Stanford and beyond who have risked so much and are risking so much by making complaints about sexual harassment. It is painstaking labor, often unrecognized labor, and this lecture is for you. So it's entitled Losing Your Hand. So many complaints made within institutions end up being about them. To complain is to learn about institutions and their legacies. A complaint, a lesson in legacy. A woman of color academic talked me through the complaints she had about sexism and racism, but did not make. In explaining to me why she did not make them, she offers a sharp description of the culture of her institution. There's an agreement between people not to rock the boat. People would talk about the institution as a kind of legacy project and would imply that you didn't understand how the institution was formed. The implication was that you have to be respectful of how this place was organized and what its traditions were, essentially. And if you were not abiding by that, it was because you had not been there for 10 years. The culture of her institution is that you don't complain about the culture of the institution. If so, then institutional culture can be what stops a complaint about institutional culture. To complain is to provide evidence that you've not been in an institution long enough to understand it, to respect it, how it's organized, its traditions. The complainers will be those who have not yet internalized the norms of the institution, those for whom the project of the institution has not yet become their own. She did not complain, but that was not because the culture of the institution had become her own. She didn't complain because, as one or two academics of color in an otherwise all-white department, she did not want to stand out any more than she already did. But because the problem she did not complain about did not go away, she decides to leave for another post. So she submits a resignation letter, which takes the form of a complaint about how sexism and racism were part of the culture of the institution. And the other academic of colour resigned at the same time. After we resigned, they said we were the wrong kind of people. This is the two brown people in the department of around 50 people. Being the wrong kind of people, not white, not right, is used to explain and dismiss that complaint. So if complaints are dismissed as coming from people who are too new to abide by or respect institutional legacies, some people are dismissed as complainers, no matter how long they've been in the institution. In other words, you become a complainer by virtue of not reproducing an institutional legacy. So in this lecture, I consider what we learn about legacy from those who do not reproduce them. A legacy can mean something that happened in the past or what the past leaves behind, as a war leaves a legacy of suffering, for instance. Legacy can be something transmitted by or received from our predecessors. When a legacy becomes a project, it signals a relationship to what has been received. Think of the words she uses: respectful, abiding, also understand. So in this lecture, I'm going to bring together two research projects, the first on complaint and the second on common sense. For the former, I spoke to academics and students who had made or considered making complaints about abuses of power and inequalities within universities. And in 2021, I published a book, Complaint, ! Which drew on this research. So this book was very much focused on the university and on the work of trying to transform universities so that they are as equal, open, and accessible as they often claim to be. I'm now writing a new book, a Complainers Handbook, a guide to building less hostile institutions, which follows on from the soon to be published, as Roland mentioned, Feminist Killjoy Handbook. Here it is. Both handbooks are intended for a wider readership, and they are giving me the space and the time to pull out the significance of my research for an understanding of institutional power and institutional change. So in this lecture, I'll also be drawing on a new project on common sense, and legacy is a concept that will allow me to travel between these two projects. So I'll start with common sense and its objects. Common sense itself could be described as a legacy project. In the UK, common sense is often spoken of as a national legacy, as what we have been bequeathed from the past in the form of a faculty. In fact, during the COVID pandemic, government officials, including the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, regularly referred to British common sense, sometimes described as good and old, other times as solid, as what we should use in making judgments about what to do, whether to mask or not, where to go, where not to go, a rather convenient way, no doubt, of displacing responsibility from government to individual. This idea of good old British common sense is an old idea, if not a good one. As historian Sophie Rosenfeld notes, by the 1720s, good old English or British common sense had become a recognizable entity. Rosenfeld also notes that giving a history of common sense can be difficult, and that this difficulty has been the starting point for so much critical work. As she describes, the historicity of our seemingly timeless natural common sense was also in the 1970s and 1980s a frequent theme of cultural theorists, from Roland Barthes to Stuart Hall. Take Stuart Hall's description of how what passes as common sense feels as if it has always been there, the sedimented bedrock wisdom of the race. I'm interested in Hall's delicate evocation of the language of feeling, common sense as a feeling of longevity, of what hangs around or goes without saying. For Hall, following Gramsci, common sense is not coherent. It is usually disjointed and episodic, fragmentary and contradictory. Into it, the traces and stratified deposits of more coherent philosophical systems have sedimented over time without leaving any clear inventory. That a history of common sense is hard to give is a sign of its historical effectiveness. So one way of giving common sense a history is to consider the status of the objects that have been used to exemplify it. I've always been fascinated by object examples. In my book, Queer Phenomenology, for instance, I caught sight of the table in Husserl's philosophy and have since been following tables around rather obsessively, and they will appear again today. In my book on the uses of use, what's the use, ? I became intrigued by how the Blacksmiths Arm was used to exemplify the naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's law of use and disuse without being used as an example by Lamarck. So when the references to the Blacksmiths Arm became substantial, the quality of substantial seemed to transfer to the thing itself. So when common sense becomes a certainty about something, common sense points to things. The analytical philosopher G.E. Moore argued that he could not be more persuaded by skeptical questions about the existence of external reality than he could by common sense. And in defending common sense, he makes use of his own hand, both in his paper In Defense of Common Sense, and then in a lecture, Proof of an External World. It is in a lecture that Moore's hand acquires an exemplary status. How do you prove the existence of an external world? He answers his question by holding up his hand. How? By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is one hand, and adding, as I make a certain gesture with the left, and here is another. The gesture is not just pointing to something, what should be obvious to somebody with common sense. It is a refutation of somebody else, the skeptics. The hand provides evidence of the folly of skepticism becoming, in other words, a tool. But note how certain is attached not to the object, the hand, but to the gesture. Perhaps recalling also the blacksmith's arm, what the hand is doing is partly that we can make reference to it. I became interested in what Moore was doing with his hand after reading a book on common sense conservatism written, and the preface to that book, which was written by the Reverend Michael Nazir-Ali. This book on common sense conservatism was produced by a new lobby group in the UK called the Common Sense Group, which now has over 50 conservative members and who describe themselves as the institutional custodians of heritage and history. There is nothing remarkable about this group. We've heard their stories before. They are old and worn, familiar from Brexit and well before, stories of taking the nation back, of taking back control, stories that are also fantasies of a nation that isn't and a past that wasn't. What interests me is how the Common Sense Group has made common sense part of a wider anti-woke, their terms, conservative agenda. So how does Ali define common sense in the preface? He writes, and this is a long quote, "Common sense came simply to mean good judgment, which is not easily swayed by intellectual or cultural fads and takes a realistic view of ourselves and what is around us. In philosophy, this view was vigorously defended by the analytical philosopher G.E. Moore, who held that when a philosophical view is in conflict with common sense, it is more likely that the view was in error rather than that common sense had gone astray. He gave the example of knowing that his hand existed and was his as being more certain than any skeptical attempts to show that such was not the case. Moore's argument can, of course, be legitimately extended to our knowledge of our body as a whole and to the different parts of it and their purpose. It could also be extended to our knowledge of our relationships, their meaning and purpose, and indeed to the social structures and institutions which provide coherence and stability to the social order. So Ali makes use of Moore's hand, moving from the philosopher's certainty that his hand existed and was his, to his own certainty about the nature of bodies and their purposes, social structures, and then institutions. So this quality of certainty is moved from an object that is relatively near and proximate to what is more complex and distant. Common sense conservatism then speaks of the stability of social institutions insofar as they are extensions of my hand or his hand. In other words, society matters here as an extension of myself or even as his or my possession. So legacy then gets turned into or treated as reality, which is how reality itself is made a possession, what is ours, what must be defended. So Moore employed his hand against the skeptics. Ali re-employs that same hand as a defense against the woke. In fact, throughout the book, there are 62 references to woke, which I've listed, as together they do make quite an impression. So it's the references to the woke that have become substantial. Rosenfeld described how common sense really only comes out of the shadows and draws attention to itself at moments of perceived crisis or collapsing consensus. The hand points to a crisis rather than resolving it. So the hand becomes not only what was there or is there or should be there, but what could be lost, which is why that certain gesture becomes necessary. The hand is what needs to be handed down from one philosopher to another, from one generation to another. And then if it's the references to woke that have become substantial, the quality of substantial transfers to the hand, which is how the hand comes to matter more, the more it is presented as missing. So how so? One contributor to the book writes, Britain is under attack, not in a physical sense, but in a philosophical, ideological, and historical sense. Our heritage is under a direct assault. The very sense of what it is to be British has been called into question. Institutions have been undermined. The reputation of key figures in our country's history have been traduced. This gives huge power to activists and forces the leaders of organizations to fight endless fires of grievance, stifling freedom, embittering the workplace, and sowing division. Consider first this description of activism as fires of grievance. In my book, Complaint, I did not use the language of hegemonic complainers because I was well aware how many complaints in the workplace are dismissed as if they derive from those who are either powerful or have a will to be so. The minimization of harm and the inflation of power often work together, as if some make slights more than they are to make themselves bigger. But perhaps we can use the words hegemonic complaint for this discourse to describe what is going on here. So hegemonic complaint functions as a kind of meta complaint, a complaint about complaint, those minor grievances made by mischievous minorities. but that meta-complaint would not register as complaint. It would be made without leaving a clear inventory because of how it's become common sense, a feeling of what is or is not there. So the author evokes Black Lives Matter and decolonizing the curriculum as examples of wokeism, as assaults on what it means to be British. He writes that these movements are not motivated by positivity, quite the reverse. I don't know why it always makes me laugh. I'm taking it seriously. Positivity here is tied to preservation. And this is why the story of negativity is more than a story of motivation. By locating negativity in the outsider, culture and history are stabilized and given a positive quality. He adds, words that have been universally understood for millennia, such as man and woman, are now emotionally charged and dangerous. Of course, this statement is not true. Words change, language changes as we do. Even to question the meaning of words such as man or woman, trying to open them up, is treated as giving them a negative charge or even as stopping people from using them. Another conservative politician, he's since become British Prime Minister, said, we want to confront this left-handed culture that seems to want to cancel our history, our values, our women. This argument that women are being cancelled, expressed with that old sexist possessive, our women, draws loosely from the gender critical argument that the term gender has replaced the term sex. Perhaps we're supposed to treat sex like a statue, what you have to affirm as being there, what is supposed to stand up or stand firm. So all you have to do to be heard as complaining, as damaging legacy, is not to affirm something. So when students asked for more philosophers from outside the West to be taught, offering, I would say, nuanced, careful critiques, they are represented very quickly as cancelling white philosophers, asking for more as stealing what is there or from who is there. Consider how building more accommodating institutions often requires widening them. So yes, widening the range of texts being published and read, and yes, widening the range of meanings, including of words such as man and woman, and also widening the doors so more people can enter, and also widening the routes into professions, and also widening who can become professors. Heidi Mirza, a woman of colour professor, described a conversation at her inaugural lecture as professor. A white male professor leaned into me at the celebration drinks and whispered bitterly in my ear, well, they're giving chairs to anyone for anything these days. When a woman of colour becomes a chair, chairs lose their status and value. So the value of some things is made dependent on the restriction of who can have them or be them. This is how a woman of colour professor becomes a damage to legacy. She becomes, or we become, evidence of how some are losing their hand. So this second section is called Polishing the Table. So the hand of common sense conservatism is extended as certainty from what is mine to social relationships and institutions. I want to show in the remainder of this lecture how this extension is not simply an act of individual cognition, but an institutional mechanism. To have a place at the table, you are required to affirm something, its reality, its value, its status as possession. And I'm going to describe this requirement to affirm as polishing the table. To polish can mean to make something smooth and shiny by friction or coating, to see to one's appearance or to refine and improve. The word polish shares a root with the word polite. In the UK, the history of the British Empire is often told as a very polite story of well-mannered, polite colonizers. So in other words, polishing has become a national pastime. Those of us living and working in the UK whose families come from former British colonies are asked, nay, required, to gloss over the violence of the histories that led us to be here. And so when our arrival is understood as damage to legacy, we are tasked with repairing that damage. I remember one time as a junior lecturer, I designed a new course on race and colonialism. I was asked to attend the university committee for the course to be approved, along with others. We were all seated at a large rectangular table in the fanciest room in the fanciest building. I was the only person of colour at the table. And a professor from another department began to interrogate me, getting angrier as he went on, and he went on. I can't remember everything he said, but the word in the course description that triggered his reaction was the relatively uneventful word implicated. That I had used that word was a sign, he said, that I thought colonialism was a bad thing. He then gave me a lecture on how colonialism was a good thing, colonialism as modernity, that happy story of railways, language, and the law that is so familiar because we've heard it before. So we could describe empire as world polishing. We are required to tell the story of empire as a happy story, not only to remove the violence, but to remove evidence of that removal. So why polishing the table specifically? My own anecdote involves an actual table, but tables also matter metaphorically, evoking what is shared. In The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt writes, to live together in the world means essentially that a world of things is between those who have it in common, as a table is located between those who sit around it. For Arendt, pluralism is about partiality. When each of us sees the table from a different aspect or side, together we see more of the table. Arendt turns to consider common sense more directly in Life of the Mind in the first section, Thinking. She observes, in a world of appearances filled with error and semblance, reality is guaranteed by this threefold commonness. The five senses, utterly different from each other, have the same object in common. Members of the same species have the same context in common that endows every single object with its particular meaning, and all other sense-endowed beings, though perceiving this object from utterly different perspectives, agree on its identity. Out of this threefold commonness arises the sensation of reality. It's a very phenomenologically rich description, I would add, of common sense. So she begins here with the classical conception of common sense as a sixth sense that allows us to apprehend that each sense has the same object in common, that the table we touch is the same table that we see, and so on. To common sense as a context in which that object is given meaning, to the role of other sense-endowed beings. So one commentator suggests that other sense-endowed beings might agree the identity of the object in the following way. A bird may not understand why humans make tables, but by actually sitting on it, the bird confirms the table's reality. So I'm going to be jumping off Arendt's table here to consider how the table can be what appears to bring us together. In other words, to think of the table as a happy fable. A happy fable of the table might be that everyone is welcome because they add another viewpoint. Diversity could be described as a happy fable of the table. Diversity as institutional polishing, polishing the table to create a better reflection of the institution. So one diversity practitioner described diversity as a big shiny apple. It all looks wonderful, but the inequalities aren't being addressed. Diversity can be a way of not addressing inequalities by appearing to do so. So that shiny apple often becomes a smiley brown face. In other words, people of color provide the smiles, or we become the polish. But that does not mean that we don't ourselves have to labor to see through it. A postgraduate student was being harassed by her supervisor. She's a woman of color. She's the first person in her family to get to university. She's had to fight really hard to get here. She's explaining to me why it's so hard to see what is going on, to see that her professor, her mentor, was harassing her, she describes. And it's odd to think back in this moment, this seems absolutely insane to me, but at the time it was part of the culture of the department we had. You know, another professor I had met with early in the program said, you know, that he had to keep a big wooden table between him and his female students so he would remember not to touch them. And then another of our longtime male faculty is notorious for marrying student after student after student. And that was within all of this rhetoric of critical race studies and, you know, pedagogy of the oppressed. As I'm recounting it to you, I just want to say that it is so jarring to look back on it because it looks so very clear from this hindsight perspective. When what you experience at the time is part of the culture, you don't identify it at the time you experience it. The harassment, which was institutionalized, expressed in the idea that senior men would need a big wooden table in order not to remember to touch women students, is happening at the same time the critical work is happening, or at least that the rhetoric of critical work is used to describe what is happening, critical race studies, pedagogy of the oppressed. So it becomes clear in time that that critical work is about rhetoric and that there is a gap between rhetoric and reality, and that clarity is jarring. That clarity is jarring. So the table then can be a sedimented history of harassment, a history of who gets to do what, of who is assumed to be entitled to what. To polish the table is to wipe away that history. And if we don't polish the table, we might be the ones who are wiped away. A woman of color academic describes, I was on the equality and diversity group in the university, and as soon as I started mentioning things to do with race, they changed the portfolio of who could be on the committee, and I was dropped. I think back to how the professor heard a no in my use of the word implicated. Polishing can mean more than smiling for their brochures. It can require using words that gloss over our experience. If we use a word like race, we get in the way of their occupation of space. So we smile or vanish, or perhaps we smile and vanish. When I resigned in protest at the failure of my university to deal with the problem of sexual harassment, this was the response by the university. We take sexual harassment very seriously and take action against those found to be acting in ways incompatible with our strong values relating to equality, diversity, and inclusion. Of course, if any of this had been remotely true, I wouldn't have had to resign. But note how diversity as well as equality and inclusion can be used to counter the evidence of complaint. Diversity as a repair job, polishing as papering over, an effort to repair damage to reputation, papering over the problems. So if diversity and equality can be polished, so too can policies and procedures. Complaint is often pictured as a flowchart with straight lines and arrows that give the would-be complainer a clear route through. I look at that flowchart and I also see diversity. Things are not always as they appear. One academic describes complaint procedures and policies as window dressing and said, they did not mean what they said. Another described them as tripwire and said, the policies are not meant. She talks about how you were stopped from using the policy to do something, to do what it was intended to do, rather like a trespasser is stopped from entering a building. So those policies and procedures, even if they don't mean what they say, still exist as papers that can be used as evidence of the university's commitments. These papers might cross-reference other papers, other policies and procedures, equality and diversity, dignity at work, and so on, piling up to create a paper legacy. When I think of policies and procedures as paper legacies, I think again of the Blacksmiths Arm, how references to something can create an impression of it, and how something can become more impressive without existing at all. So when policies and procedures are window dressing, they can be how the organization appears from the front. Perhaps a diversity table, that happy table, the polished table, is a table we see from the front. So a woman professor noticed that the senior managers at her university were always huddled around the same lunch table, she describes. I realized that all the decisions were actually being taken around the lunch table by the small group of men who actually went off and discussed what they wanted to discuss and decided what they wanted to decide, and that's how things happen in the school. So I started trying to have my lunch with them. I thought I'm going to break into the circle and try and fight my way in, but that didn't work. They would just get up and go. So decisions are made at that table, the lunch table, informally, which means they use the other tables, the official tables we sometimes call committees, where items are tabled to get what they want through. When she tries to join the table, they leave. So this is how tables, which appear to invite everyone to be seated, can become doors, how some are stopped from participating in the very places where decisions are being made. Tables, how some are shut out. To see who is shut out is to see through a veneer. Let me return to the experience of the woman of colour who was dropped from the diversity committee for mentioning things to do with race. You would expect that at a diversity committee you would mention such things, but no. So why did she keep mentioning them? Racism, that's why. She told me that in her department's research meetings, senior white men professors frequently made racist comments. This is just one example. I'm from London, and London is just ripe for ethnic cleansing. She described how people laughed at that moment and how the laughter filled the room. So she decides to make a complaint. She gathers statements from around 20 people in her department. So complaints can be collectives. And a meeting is set up in response to her complaint. And at that meeting, she's described by the head of human resources as having a chip on her shoulder. They treated the submission as an act of arrogance on my part. So a grievance, heard as a grudge, a we turned into a me. She leaves and it was all swept under the carpet and the same things continued. Sweep, sweep, polish, polish. The same things keep happening because of how much is swept away, because of who is swept away. So those who complain see what's under the carpet. We also know that the table is shiny because of what is not seen. So when she is dropped from the diversity table for mentioning things to do with race, her colleagues are given permission to make racist comments at that same table. This is how, under the banner of diversity, you are allowed to be racist, but not call somebody racist. Perhaps because the Latter Speech Act brings the whole thing into disrepute, or even just into view, the table itself. Or you might be invited to join that table only to be interrogated because of how you appear. A trans student of colour made a complaint about sexual harassment and transphobic harassment from their supervisor, who kept asking deeply intrusive questions about their gender identity and their genitals. These questions were laced with a language of concern for the welfare of the student, predicated on judgment that they will be endangered if they conducted research in their home country. So when they complain, what happens? People were just trying to evaluate whether he was right to believe there will be some sort of physical danger to me because of my gender identity, as if to say he was right to be concerned. The same questions that led you to complain are asked because you complain. And these questions make the concern right, or even into a right to be concerned. So much harassment today is enacted as a right to be concerned. A right to be concerned about immigration as citizens, a right to be concerned as sex-based rights as adult human females, for instance. A right to be concerned is how violence is enacted, premised on suspicion that some are not who they say they are, that some have no right to be where they are. And that violence can be made to disappear. That's what polishing the table is letting us see. So I spoke to an academic who had been bullied by her head of department for many years. One time he begins shouting at her. So then he started to yell and I stood up. You go out of the office and then to the left is a little passageway to the door. So when I went up to the front door and it has 2 locks that you have to turn in 2 different directions. And I had all my bags on me. And then up behind me came a pair of hands and pulled my hands off the lock. He sort of wrapped his arm around me. And so I was constrained with my arms by my sides. I thought, I don't know what to do. I thought, if I try to get to the front door again, he may grab me again. The lock turns in 2 different directions. It's hard to know which way it turns, which way to turn. And the hands that come up, pulling her hands off the lock becomes a hand a lock, stopping her from getting out. She does get out, but it was hard. So she does submit a formal complaint, in part because her university had new complaints procedures, only she learns they didn't mean anything. He's suspended during an inquiry, but he is cleared of wrongdoing. So how? In the report, he is described as having a direct style of management, as if being physically violent is like blunt speech, being rough as a way of expressing himself. And what about the assault itself? In the report, it is described as on par with a handshake. On par equals equal. A physical assault is turned into a friendly greeting. And so we learn description can be polished. The violence of an action is removed by how it is described. So he keeps his position, his head department, and she is moved. So when violence is removed, we're also talking about the removal of people, those to whom that violence was directed, those who say no to it, who are not willing to let it be passed over. So polishing the table is also about who is missing, who is not here. I talked to an early career academic who made a complaint after she was not given the time she needed to return to work after a period of extended sick leave. She is neuroatypical and she needs that time, also space, to do her work. So she describes her experience of complaint thus. It was like a little bird scratching away at something, and it wasn't really having any effect. It was just really small, and behind closed doors. I think people maybe feel that because of the nature of the complaint and you're off work, so they have to be polite and not talk about it. And so much of their politeness is because they don't want to say something. And maybe it is to do with being in an institution and the way they are built, long corridors, doors with locks on them, windows with blinds that come down. It seems to sort of imbue every part of it with a cloistered feeling. There is no air. It feels suffocating. It was like, note this it. When you have to fight for room, you can become conscious of just what little room you have. A complaint then acquires exteriority, becoming a thing in the world, scratching away, a little bird, all your energy going into an activity that matters so much to what you can do and who you can be, but barely seems to leave a trace. The more you try, the smaller it becomes. The smaller you become, smaller and smaller still. So much that is painful is left unsaid, perhaps out of politeness. A little bird scratching away. I hear that description. I remember how diversity work was described to me by a practitioner as a banging your head against a brick wall job. The wall keeps its place, so you are the one that gets sore. And what happens to the wall? All you seem to have done is scratch the surface, scratching at the surface. And that's what doing diversity work can feel like. Scratching gives you a sense of the limits of what you can accomplish. But notice how the little bird has come up again. This time the bird does not land on the table, confirming its reality, but has something else to say. That bird is scratching away. When I heard her description, I felt a queer kinship with the bird, the sense of being alone, as being small, also fragile, in the face of something big, even insurmountable. In my book on the uses of use, I wrote about queer use, how things can be used in ways that were not intended or by those for whom they were not intended. So the birds turn a postbox into a nest. For the postbox to become a nest, it has to stop being used as a postbox. Otherwise, the birds will be displaced by the letters. So the birds can be strangers. They can be us, those for whom institutions were not intended, trying to create an almost nest in a hostile environment. That's why we don't just sit on the table confirming its reality. We would be unseated. A legacy, that paper legacy, is also a postal system, how the papers pile up those letters, leaving some of us little room to breathe. To queer use usually requires then a world-making effort. We have to stop the same things from happening, the same old letters being posted in the same old box. This next section is called Legacy as Instruction. So if a legacy is a story of what is removed, what is polished away, that polishing is an activity. There's a hand at that table. So who performs that activity and why? My opening quote in this lecture defined the legacy project as an agreement between people not to rock the boat. Some people more than others need to be reminded of that agreement. The expression rocking the boat came up repeatedly in my interviews, most often in the form of a warning. I spoke to one student who was involved in a collective complaint with other students about sexual harassment. She describes such a warning. I was repeatedly told that rocking the boat or making waves would affect my career in the future and that I would ruin the department for everyone else. I was told if I did put in a complaint, I would never be able to work in the university and that it was likely I wouldn't get a job elsewhere. So complaints are framed as how you would damage a department or institution, as well as yourself, how you would deprive yourself of a career path. Warnings about complaint are part of a cluster of speech acts we usually call career advice. You're being told what you should do, as well as what you should not do in order to go further. The students had a meeting with the head of department, and during that meeting, the head of department said, feminist, gay, black theory, we're all old-fashioned. If you do that, you're never going to have a career. So old-fashioned as a lot of work as a judgment, that kind of theory, that kind of research, perhaps even those kind of people become old and slow and tired, as if to say, do that, be that, and you too will end up behind. So the hand of common sense, remember that certain gesture, becomes the hand of correction, telling you don't go that way, go this way, that this way is the right way, the way you need to go to get what you need. A well-used definition of common sense is sound and practical judgment. So complaints are impractical, or complaints are made impractical. In that same meeting, the head of department offers the students money for a feminist conference. She said, we can give you money. Who would you want for your dream list of academics to come and do this conference? She said, that way you can educate everyone about women. The students realized they were being offered a bribe by how it worked, because they began excitedly talking to each other about who they could invite to their dream conference. So a hand comes up, not just to say, no, don't do this. A hand can also be a yes, to correct as to redirect. That's right. I learned from this story how you can be redirected away from complaint by being invited to express yourself in a more positive way, including your feminism, through a conference, education, and how in return you will be promised resources. A legacy can be about what you have to do to receive that promise, that transmission of resources. And warnings then can be heard as error messages, like beep, beep, that signal the failure of transmission. So an MA student was considering whether to make a complaint about the conduct of a professor in her department. He was in fact the most senior professor. She has an essay tutorial with him, and she tells him she wants to write her essay on gender and race. He says, if you write on those fucking topics, you are going to fucking fail my course. You haven't fucking understood anything I've been talking about if you think those are the correct questions for this course. When you ask the wrong questions, you witness the violence of correction, the hand of redirection. But then he says, wait, you know what? You're so fucking old. Your grades don't really matter. You're not going to have a career in academia. So write whatever essay you wanted to write. You're going to fail, but it doesn't matter, right? She hears herself being written off. The complainer, who is questioning the syllabus, becomes the feminist who's got the questions wrong, becomes the old woman who might as well be wrong, a hag as well as a nag, who is too old for it to matter whether she gets it wrong, because she can't proceed, she won't proceed. So she decides to make a complaint because she wanted to prevent other students from having to go through such a practice. So complaints can be thought of here as non-reproductive labour, the work you have to do to stop the same things from happening, that transmission of legacy. She tells the convener of the MA that she's going to complain, and she receives another warning that takes the form, be careful, he's an important man. Be careful, he's an important man. So a warning becomes a judgment about who is important, as well as a direction saying, don't go there. She does go there. She goes ahead with the complaint. And in her terms, she sacrificed the references. And in reference to the prospect of doing a PhD, she said, that door is closed. References can be doors, how some are stopped from progressing. That door is closed. That door is closed on her complaint, but also on her. So she will not be there bringing to the institution what she might have brought to it. But that same door is kept open for him, so he can keep doing what he's been doing, where he's been doing it, behind closed doors. An important man. An important man has a legacy. An important man is a legacy. You might be told not to complain about an important man because you need a reference from him, or you might be told to refer to an important man. Remember the woman of colour who was dropped from the diversity committee for mentioning things to do with race? Another time she wrote a paper for a special issue of a journal on decolonising her discipline. She receives feedback from a white editor. The response of the editor was, needs to be toned down, not enough scholarly input to back up the claims they're making. Basically, get back in your box, and if you want to decolonise, we'll do it on our terms. Get back into your own box. Remember those birds? All it takes to be displaced is the letters being posted in the same old way. Whiteness can be just as occupying of spaces when they are designated decolonial. We might call this, I sometimes call this decolonial whiteness. So you are issued the same instructions: tone it down, remove yourself from your text, cite right, cite white. So that instruction is not just telling you who to cite or how to appear or how to disappear in your own text. These instructions are shaping an institutional landscape, creating paths to follow, people also. The more a path is used, the more a path is used, the more he is cited, the more he is cited. And that path can be a path to promotion. A retired academic told me how her application for promotion to professor was put in the bin. The university decided to award only one professorship during the promotion process. So who did get put forward? And of course, it was a man far less qualified than any of the women who had applied. The head of department's argument was that he had very important contacts in the community. In order to keep this guy, they had to give him the promotion because they didn't want to lose him. They didn't want to lose him. A door is open to him because of who he brings with him. Importance is predicated on connections. And to progress, you might be told you need to have or to make the right connections. So if the story of an important man, that figure, is a story of who is protected and promoted, it is also a story of how many get enlisted into doing that work. An early career lecturer talked about why people didn't make complaints at her university because of who would receive them. People don't want to rock the boat with senior academics because they are so important and they bring in this grant money and their names really matter. Not rocking the boat can be about how some people try to protect their relationships with those whose names matter. Protect their relationships, protect those people. When I think about that word protection, I hear silence. And when I think back to my own experience of complaint, that's what I hear, silence. Silence can be a wall. I recall our own efforts over 3 years when I was still at my college of trying to get the university to acknowledge the problem of sexual harassment, to acknowledge there had been inquiries. We could not get an acknowledgement in public that the inquiries had even taken place. It was like they had never happened, which I think was the effect they were looking for. The very first mention of these inquiries in public was in fact a post on my own blog, Feminist Killjoys, written just after I resigned, which is probably telling you something about why I resigned. The university treated my resignation posts as a leak, as making a mess, as causing damage. But it was not just the university that treated my disclosure as damaging. A feminist colleague called my action unprofessional, as it would cause a fallout which damages us all now and in the future. I think we're learning what it means to be professional. To be professional is to be willing to keep the institution's secrets. Consider Edward Said's definition of professionalism: not rocking the boat, not straying outside the accepted paradigms or limits, making yourself marketable and above all presentable. So much violence is enabled and reproduced because people do not or will not rock the boat, which means there's so much violence in keeping things steady or in steadying. It's important to note that this silence is not something enforced by management or only enforced by management or marketing departments. Silence can be performed as loyalty, turned into a duty by our own colleagues. Silence to protect important people, silence to protect resources, silence to protect reputation, individual, institutional, silence as promotion, how you maximize your chances of going further or getting more from the institution. So maybe when we complain, especially loudly or in public, we are seen as ruining other people's chances of getting further or getting more. This might be why those with whom we share a political allegiance can be among those who are most insistent that we're not doing it right, that we're not professional enough or polite enough or polished enough, that we're complaining too much or in the wrong way. Audre Lorde told us this would happen. She said that those who are resourced by the master's house, or even those who just question what he's doing in there, will find those who are trying to dismantle it will find them threatening. Let me repeat that. Lorde deserves to be got right. Audre Lorde told us, she said, those who are resourced by the master's house will find those who try to dismantle it, or perhaps those who just question what he is doing in there, threatening. That is Lorde's word, and that is our work. This is my conclusion. Complaint as a queer method. In my book, Complaint, I point to how complaint is a rather queer experience. And I mean queer in the old sense of odd. Words commonly used by participants in my study were bizarre, weird, strange, and surreal. It was reflecting on the queer nature of complaints, why this queerness matters and what it's telling us, that led me to decide to research common sense. To take you through some of the steps in that process, let me return to common sense conservatism. We could compare the book written by the Common Sense Conservative Group to the Sewell Report, which was published in 2021, the UK government's most recent report on race. The report declared that there was no evidence of institutional racism in the United Kingdom. It claimed that some ethnic groups did not do very well because they were too negative, and that they dwell on racism or are haunted, a word from the report, by history. It suggests we see the positives in slavery. Yes, it was a polished report. And it's important for us to recognize that it was authored primarily by Black and brown British people. I think of this in the following way. Diversity becomes a door deal. The door is open to some of us as long as we shut that door right behind us, shut that door on others like us, shut that door by not even thinking of ourselves as one of the others. And then consider this. You are more likely not to be stopped by institutional racism if you deny it exists. You might even be promoted. And then your promotion can be used as evidence that it does not exist. So polishing is tied to progression. The more you deny, the further you go. And when polishing is tied to progression, so much disappears, a disappearing as a clearing, no inventory. So common sense then, as an institutional sense, can be about what is removed, what has become imperceptible, almost like a hand trick. Common sense as a hand trick, puff, puff. The lecturer who described her complaint as a little bird scratching away at something watched her complaint disappear as a result of a sleight of hands. She would go into meetings and there would be nods, nod, 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 promises of movement, and then nothing. When a hand makes a complaint disappear, the hand disappears. Or remember how a physical assault was turned into a handshake. A hand can disappear by being made friendly. So the queerness of experiences of complaint is an intimacy with the different techniques used to stop them. Not just warnings, those no's, some spoken softly, others harshly, but also yeses, nods, polished descriptions, sleights of hands. The paper too, we notice the papers because they're not in order. I've described this as the official picture of a complaint, the flowchart, that procedure as a paper legacy. A complaint pictured from the complainer's point of view looks more like this. It's a mess. You can get in, but you can't work out how to get out. That mess can also be thought of as a queer map of the institution. I think of tracing paper and how when you move the paper just a bit, the general effect is wonky or even queer. To complain is to see what does not line up, what is obscured by the coherence of the picture. We encounter the real. And when I say real, I mean sensational stuff, hitting a wall, scratching the surface, the wear and the tear of coming up against the same thing. And yet to complain is often to be treated as withdrawing from a common world, a shared world, the real world. Perhaps it's because we are getting closer to the real that we are judged as losing a relation to it. So these lines can also offer a queer map as traces of the places we have been to try and get our complaints through. And that labor gives us a lead. It leads us to each other. So even when our complaints end up filed away, the papers can still get out and we can get out too. So one postgraduate student made a complaint about bullying and harassment by her supervisors. She receives a letter in her postbox. I got a secret letter in my mailbox saying that they had heard I was having a difficult time with them, that there was a history of women leaving the department bullied by them, and there were 2 personal emails. I contacted them both. To make a complaint is how you find out about other complaints, earlier complaints, secret letters, secret files. I talked to a disabled student about how hard it was to get anywhere with her complaint about the failure of the university to make reasonable accommodations. She told me of one very difficult meeting. Suddenly, after that meeting, a file appears. A load of documents turned up in the student union's fax machine, and we don't know where they came from. They were historical documents about students who had to leave. The student speculates that a secretary was doing her own little bit of direct action, releasing the files to give support to the student's complaint that she was not supposed to give, an act of sabotage and solidarity. So if the student hadn't made her complaint, that file would have stayed put, dusty and buried. And I think, again, of the lecturer who described her complaint as a little bird scratching away at something, she also said, I wouldn't have realized that I was not the only one. And it was quite amazing, actually, to find that in my department, there were more than a handful of staff who were there complaining about the same people, about the same issues. But all of us were not doing it in silence, but in an atomized way. So that none of us knew, actually, that we were all having similar problems and were making similar complaints. And I think the mechanism of the university is such that it wants people to be doing this in secret, because then the issues are kind of invisible, actually, unless you happen to talk to somebody or there is somebody who is willing to confide. When we use words like atomization to describe a process, we are resisting that process. So although complaints procedures can be isolating, and perhaps they are designed to be so, making us seem smaller by keeping us apart, the very labor of complaint leads you to find others, similar complaints, similar problems. And this is how then the work of complaint can offer an alternative, institutional or maybe counter-institutional legacy, or can allow the emergence of what we might call, following Kara Keeling, a queer common sense. Kara Keeling describes queer common sense as how we make much of what has been imperceptible perceptible by giving room to the eccentric. And I think of my own research as participating in this process of making something perceptible. One person tweeted me after reading the book Complaint, it makes me and probably a gazillion other people sadly feel as if you've been listening at my door, reading my text, being copied on the email I sent, gosh, just this morning to say, the guy I've been reporting for the past 6 years is still at it, surprise. He's still at it, it's still happening. And it can help to know that our complaints are not singular, because when what happens keeps happening, it can be hard not to feel that you're the problem, that you're making it happen somehow. So hearing about other people's complaints can help us to handle our own. And in hearing about other people's complaints, we are getting them out of institutions as well as out of ourselves. So the lecturer who described her complaint as a little bird scratching away at something, she too, like me, left her post and profession, and she turned her resignation letter into a performance. I wrote a 2-page letter, and it was really important to me to put everything in there that I felt so that it was down on paper. I asked for a meeting with the dean. I read the letter out in a performative kind of way, just to have some kind of event. She finds a way to make her letter matter. She manages to get it all down, to express it, to perform it. And her complaint then fills the room that she leaves. But still, she wanted to do more. She wanted to put her complaint on the wall. I just thought, I'm not the kind of person who'll put my resignation letter on the wall, but I just wonder what it is that made me feel that I'm not that kind of person, because inside, I am that kind of person. I just couldn't quite get it out. Perhaps that is what complaints are about, how we get our letters onto the wall. Later, she came to a lecture in which I shared her testimony, and she wrote to me after. It was only after the lecture that I realized how undignified these complaint processes are, and how, yes, my dignity was stripped. In my dealings with the union, they had advised me at the time that my dignity at work had been breached. But that word did little then for me, as it felt like another procedural piece of jargon. But when I felt a swell of pride at the lecture, indeed, when I felt a sense of dignity about it all, I realized that this must have been somewhat lost. Words too can be emptied of meaning, becoming polish, how we are removed from our own stories. Working together, giving each other a hearing, is how those same words can acquire sense and meaning, a common sense even. These words come to mean more because we can hear how they were dismissed as mere scratch and scribble, as damage to legacy. That's why we don't want to polish away the scratches. They are testimony. I think of how, when I left, students put words from my work onto the wall. Yes, they were taken down, but they cannot stop them from having been there. I'm still moved by the beauty of this gesture. Thank you.
Of course, we have a few minutes for questions.
Would anyone like to ask a question?
We have mics.
We have mics. Comments, questions, thoughts, feelings. A hand.
Extraordinarily powerful. Yeah, thanks so much for that. Extraordinarily powerful. I've followed your work for years. I admire what you've done, and sort of as a true ally, you gave up a lot to kind of promote your message and seek equity. You're at an institution whose own reputation in relation to the way it handles complaints and in the way that departments behave in relation to their own students or their colleagues is sullied. That's one way to put it. And there are people present both here and online who are instrumental in perpetuating the kinds of institutions that you are opening up for us and decrying. What would you say to those people who are listening to you? What words of courage or empowerment would you provide for them to take forward and put into action the very strong and courageous message that you live?
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's a very good question, an important question. I remember one time I was giving a lecture at another important institution with important people in it. And I was talking about nodding as a non-performative, how a lot of people would nod as a way of doing nothing. That looks like they're receiving the complaint, but actually they're doing nothing. And students came up to me afterwards and said to me, Sarah, did you notice that all the city managers on the front row were all nodding? And like they were nodding at my critique of nodding. And there's a way in which sometimes even you can think you're hearing something or taking it in whilst enacting it at the same time. And it's really, really hard to get through that. And I'm very, very conscious of going into institutions where many of the mechanisms that I'm trying to describe are being enacted. And sometimes that means that there are certain people that are not in this room, the rooms in which I'm speaking, because those rooms are occupied by histories of harassment and what happens when you make complaints about harassment that mean that those people can't be in the room. So I'm very, very conscious of that, and I have a responsibility to that. So what can I say to those people? You know, I think of myself as addressing the people who get it because they've been in that place of doing the work of complaint. But it is still my hope that the message gets through to others. But I think of it as an invitation to do the harder work of listening. You know, in the Killjoy Handbook, I have what I call Killjoy commitments. There's quite a few of them, 10, I think. One of them is I'm willing to be inconvenient, so to get in the way of the happiness of others, to say words like race in the diversity committee, to point out harassment as an institutional problem each time it gets minimized as an individual problem. But the second commitment or another commitment in the Killjoy Handbook is I'm willing to be inconvenienced. And that's the harder thing. And then I think that when we're really talking about the resistance to actually doing the work, we're talking about the way in which that work requires giving up people's attachments to institutions, to place, to projects, and actually changing how they do their work in relationship to others. It's more than changing policies. You can change policies as if it's changing culture, but because it's not, changing policies can be a way of not changing culture. It's actually much harder work. It requires going right back to the beginning, thinking through what the university is for and who can be in the institution. So I hope when I think about being a feminist ear and what it means to listen to complaint and the labor of that listening, it is an invitation to everybody to become part of that project. But I don't feel confident that the people that are enacting the problem are going to be hearing the message. I have no confidence. I'm sorry, I don't. But it doesn't mean that I'm not going to keep doing the work, because I know who I'm speaking to.
Hello, I'm Banya. Hi, Sarah. I'm Banya. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for this talk today. The way you brought together these two projects was really powerful and moving, and I really appreciated it. My question has to do with the way that you were thinking about disappearance. You used the word a few times throughout today's talk to talk about the way things are disappeared or made to disappear. You talked about the sleight of hand, the hand trick. And at the end of your book on complaint, you write really movingly about the way that things don't disappear, right? You write really movingly about the way that complaints go on even after the complainers become really fatigued and really exhausted and can't continue complaining. You write about how the complaint has this life, remains buried, and remains in some degree available for future complainers to draw upon. And I'm wondering about how you kind of think through the tension between those two ideas, the tension between disappearance and the longevity of complaint.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think in a way, the techniques that I'm describing are how complaints are made to disappear from the institution's own view. So one of the images in complaint is of the institutional blinds. It actually comes from a description in somebody's testimony. She talks about how the blinds are always down, the doors are shut and the blinds are down, and the corridors are narrow. And a lot of the conceptual work that I'm doing in the book comes from the people I talk to, who are giving these incredibly vivid descriptions of institutions and how they work in terms of the kind of physicality of space. So it was this detail in her testimony, the blinds coming down, that really made me see something. Like the blinds come down because of what is seen. The blinds come down in order for what is seen not to be dealt with. So there's a way in which disappearance, it is precisely about what is, disappearance doesn't mean it's gone away. Disappearance means we do not have to deal with it, because there's no obvious trace in the official record. And so what's important to me is to show that what has been made to disappear has not gone, and what has been made to disappear still goes on. And that sometimes, in effect, we carry the traces, we are the inventory. Those who made the complaints also have the memories and the knowledges. The files don't just get put in the cabinet, they get stored in our bodies. And so we remember what has been made to disappear. And even when we leave the institution, we leave traces of ourselves behind us. So I think that there's an absolutely important, vital connection between the techniques that stop the labor of complaint appearing within the institution and the experience of actually carrying on and carrying it on.
So I wanted to talk about, tables and power.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking of the expression turning the tables, which comes from chess, and you switch the position from weakness to power by taking your opponent's point of view. And I was thinking about Jennifer Freud's notion of Darvo, right? The reversal of victim and offender. And I'm struck by, not just in terms of administrators or people in power and politically, that they really have no sense of their own power. In other words, they turn themselves into victims. You are, by complaining, besieging them with an unwanted task. And so you are all of a sudden empowered, when in actuality, it's completely the opposite. And it's the farthest thing from common sense. How do you explain that? That prime ministers or presidents can say, you know, this woke culture is imperiling us. The only way I can make sense of it is it legitimizes this extremely violent reaction.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's part of the way in which power often operates is by magnifying the threat of the other. And so it's always a question of defending oneself. And in the act of defending oneself against those whose power is inflated, you actually make yourself appear smaller. And so, you know, I think there is a lot of reversals in the data, in effect, that I've been sharing with you. And one of them is the way in which the complainer is positioned as an I, like as a me, a singular person. So this is partly procedural, that many complaints procedures require a complaint to come from one person, but it's also just a way of making the complaint seem smaller and separating the complainer from the group. So the example being the woman of color who collected a complaint from 20 people, but is still told she's got a chip on her shoulder. So that we is turned into a me. And in many ways, what I'm trying to show with the common sense discourse is the hand, my hand, his or my possession. The I disappears by being turned into a we. So it's a reversal of the process. So a we hides as an I, and a we, the we of the complainer, the complaint collective, is made smaller by being made into an I. So this transformation of I's to we's and we's to I's is part of how power operates by withdrawing itself. Like you can't see what's going on. And I think that we can look at those processes the best we can and do critiques of them. And what I'm sort of also trying to say is that it's not simply about the problem with, you know, how complaints are managed or handled as some sort of separate issue from how institutions do their work. Those reversals are already there in institutional culture and institutional life, where the people who are seen as not belonging to the institution in the same way as sort of strangers, as not coming from them or expressing their norms in the same way, are actually made bigger, treated as making themselves bigger. And those who are already here, who are here by virtue of being supported and enabled by the very norms institution, often see themselves as having to battle and don't see the ways in which they're supported in getting there. So that I think, you know, describing all that becomes part of the work of challenging how institutions work.
Sara, I am. I'm facilitating or teaching a graduate seminar called Contemporary Theory Lab, and your book is the first book we're reading this quarter. So there's a bunch of people in the room that are very, very excited, including myself, of course, to see you. You have in your method taking us from the signifier to the signified, the literal to the metaphoric, the thing to the concept, the dead metaphor to the live metaphor, and sometimes the image beautifully. And in light of that, I wanted to ask you, what do you make of a term, a dead metaphor, used in the States, not in Britain? In Britain, you would call someone a head of a department. In the States, you would call them a chair.
Right.
Would you indulge maybe running with that? And I'm also thinking there's like a Netflix series called The Chair these days. So what is in a chair? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in chairs. I used to joke that I got so obsessed with the queerness of tables and queernology that I forgot about the queerness of the chair. And there was a lot of really interesting queer theory work on chairs. So, I mean, I could just talk a lot about chairs in a way that might be a bit tiring. Yeah, it's really interesting when I first think about how I became obsessed with tables. I mean, it was partly because I caught sight of the table and I'm not answering the question about the chair, I'm going back to tables, but it was interesting when I caught sight of the table in Husserl. It was just the way in which the table appeared for a moment and then was put in the back of the writing as the table was what you could see from the point of view of the natural attitude. And you know, there's a kind of it's just a tiny little small description that Husserl offers of the table in front of him, and then behind him the children in the summer house, And there's just something in there about who gets to have the table in front of them. And I'm sort of thinking actual table there, but also the way in which, if you think about so many of the really interesting writers, like I'm thinking of Adrienne Rich on writing, talking about writing at her table, seated on her chair, how she can't get time to do it because she gets pulled away by the children. She can't get to attend to the table to have it in front of her. So for me, when I think about tables and chairs in terms of metaphors and metaphoricity, is that a word? It is now, and being literal, it's partly for me thinking about tables and chairs as ways in which spaces are made open or available for some to use. So I almost don't really think about it in terms of what's literal and what's metaphorical. I sort of think about sort of tables as forms of extension and chairs as forms of extension. Who gets to be one? Who gets to have that furniture made available to them? And I think one of the things that the queer theory does for me is that it really makes furniture come alive, because in general, what you're doing is you're looking at what gets relegated to the background, treated like furniture, made to disappear because it's just there and ordinary. And I think there's something very, very magical about making chairs something to think with, turning the tables, dancing with them. Chairs can do all sorts of things in the right hands.